Hey, this is Jason Kleberg from the Force 5 podcast, a show that forces a guest to come up with a movie-themed top 5 list topic, and then we reveal our picks on air. Top 5 heist films, top 5 tearjerkers, top 5 movie dogs. Every show you'll be asking yourself, what would be on my list? Guests include directors, screenwriters, actors, podcasters, musicians, authors, and even a professional wrestler. Subscribe to the Force 5 podcast, and you won't just be a listener, you'll be a list nerd. The Force 5 podcast, available wherever you're listening now.
Do you love movies? So do I. What's up, y'all? It's KB, and I love movies, inviting you to listen to The Conversation, a film podcast where passion meets perspective and opinion. From the old school to the new, I invite a guest on to discuss the movies that thrill us, challenge us, break our hearts, or even blow our minds. There's always new episodes dropping wherever you get your podcasts. So join the conversation. We don't just watch movies. We love talking about them too. The Conversation with KB Loves Movies, a part of Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Welcome to Wake Up Heavy, the world's greatest horror movie podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Wake Up Heavy. This is Mark Begley, your host, and this is the first full episode on the Spotlight series on Stephen King. And today I will be talking about the books from 1974 to 1979. Now, I probably confused people and confused myself on the introductory episode. At one point, I said I was going to go in order of the books, and then I 2 seconds later said I was going to go in the order of the movies, and that was just a misspeaking on my part. And the reason I'm doing that is because once we get to Cujo, the movies come out of order. Since this is in part about my relationship to the books as well, I thought I would just do it that way. So sorry about the confusion. This may end up being confusing all the way through, but, I think we're all relatively intelligent enough to follow along. So we are starting with 1974's Carrie, and I'll talk about the book a little bit, and then I'll talk about the movie a little bit, and that will go on through to The Dead Zone, which was published in 1979. Carrie was the 4th novel that King had written, and it ended up being the first one published. The only one that I'm sure of that came before was The Long Walk, and that was written when he was still in high school, I believe, in the mid to late 60s. And ended up being published, I should have the date for that. Late 70s, I think, under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, which will come up again and again because there are novels in between the publication of his main novels under his own name. So that will pop up. The Long Walk is finally being adapted, and it's by the director of the recent Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and a movie that I didn't care too much for the first time, but I have watched, I think, 2 more times since and liked it more each time, The Autopsy of Jane Doe. As most King fans will know, Carrie was famously saved from the dustbin by Stephen King's wife, Tabitha. A fan, I don't know if it was a fan, but someone had told King that they didn't think he could write about women. He had done all these quote-unquote macho stories prior to that. And I'm assuming, since this was his first published novel, they were talking about the multitude of short stories that had been published mainly in men's magazines. And those were collected in Night Shift in 1978. So he took that up as a challenge and decided to write a story from a female perspective. And what he ended up writing was basically the opening scene, the shower scene, where Carrie gets her first period and is harassed and bullied by the other girls in the school. He wasn't very happy how it was turning out, so he threw it away. Tabitha King fished it out, said, "No, you need to finish this. I will help you with the female perspective." And it turned into a novel. And the novel is epistolary. So along with the straight narrative, there are letters, newspaper articles, diary entries, and I think there are 2 or 3 narrators throughout. So Carrie, obviously, Sue Snell, who ends up kind of befriending her in the book and in the movie. And I'm not really sure who the third narrator is. It's been a long time since I've read Carrie, and I think it's one of those books that I didn't go back to again and again. I'm probably read it at least twice. I've definitely seen the movie more times than I've read the book, and that's going to be true for just about every movie, at least that I talk about on these episodes. So I won't repeat it ad nauseum for each different book and movie entry. When there is a variation of that, I may mention it in passing. So the book gets picked up for publication. The hardcover doesn't sell all that well. It only sells 13,000 copies. But New American Library options the paperback rights for $400,000. And according to King's contract with the hardcover publisher, he gets half of that plus royalties. The paperback sold 1 million copies in its first year, so he was off and running with his first book. And of course, when books are popular and sell well, they usually get optioned for movie rights. So a little over 2 years after publication, Carrie comes out in theaters.
Meet Carrie. She's the girl no one likes and everyone makes fun of. The girl who lives in that creepy house with her cruel mother. The girl with the strange power. She's about to turn a high school prom into a nightmare. If you have a taste for terror, you have a date with Carrie. Rated R.
Now showing at a theater near you.
Brian DePalma's previous movies, Sisters, Phantom of the Paradise, and Obsession, were all either in the horror genre or horror adjacent. Sisters is a great movie. This is one that I could do as a why didn't I rent this? And whenever I watch it, about halfway through, I kind of forget I'm watching a Brian De Palma movie and think I'm watching a David Cronenberg movie because it's very, very Canadian. So Carrie comes out. It is a critical and a commercial hit. And so this starts the fires burning. And if something does well, as Hollywood is wont to do, they like to repeat that. So we've got a slew of Carrie ripoffs around this time, TV movies and feature films. I can think of a couple that I watched sometime last year, like The Spell, The Initiation of Sarah, and De Palma even did kind of a Carrie ripoff with his next movie, The Fury, which had a lot to do with telekinesis and ESP and all that stuff. Same kind of idea, and Amy Irving's in it again. And speaking of Irving, she plays Sue Snell in Carrie. Sissy Spacek, of course, plays Carrie. We have William Catt, Nancy Allen, a De Palma staple, and we have John Travolta in an early role, and Piper Laurie as Carrie's crazy mom. Spacek and Laurie were nominated for Academy Awards. Yay for Horror Movie Academy Award nominations. The score is by Pino Donaggio, who is a favorite of mine. I have talked about him on the Tourist Trap and Howling episodes, and we've got another great score from him. There's a little bit of Bernard Herrmann throughout, and we have some interesting music in these montage scenes. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot about PJ Soles, who of course would in a couple of years be in the slasher to begin all slashers, Halloween. And yes, that is Edie McClurg in there in the background in many shots. But She is not also in The Fury. That is a common mistake, and I think I've even seen it on IMDb. It is not her. It is someone who looks very much like her. I think I even thought it was her when I watched it. It is one of the more faithful adaptations of a King work. Of course, they ditch the epistolary narrative and the multiple narrators and do a pretty much straightforward narrative for the film. All the main elements are there, and this is a movie that took me a while to get around to, and I think it had more to do actually with getting into Brian DePalma films, even though I was already a big Stephen King fan. I don't know if it was kind of that fanatical religious aspect that put me off, or if when I saw it, this was back in the old pan and scan days, and De Palma's a very visual filmmaker, uses a lot of those split diopter shots. This isn't widescreen, but still you miss a lot in either TV or VHS versions of these things. But something kind of kept me from it for a while. So at some point I did watch it. It wasn't one that I think I appreciated as much when I was younger as I do now. It is a very 70s film. The fashions and the dialogue and everything can get a little cheesy at times. The acting is very good for the most part. Of course, Spacek and Piper Laurie are amazing in it. Most of the other cast does pretty well. Nancy Allen is kind of troublesome for me sometimes. A lot of times she comes out forced, but she does fairly well in this, and most of the other minor players do too. I just think in the mid-'80s it already seemed kind of dated to me, and I can ignore that now, and I have watched this. I mean, I watch it every year at least a couple of times. I watched it not really in prep for this because I don't need to prep so much for any of these movies, but I did watch it recently, and it is definitely up at the top of my King adaptation list. And just one bit of trivia that I always forget about when I watch the movie. Priscilla Pointer plays Amy Irving's mom in the film, Miss Snell. They are real-life mother and daughter and have acted in, I think, about 7 movies together. And she is also Kyle MacLachlan's mom in Blue Velvet. There have been numerous iterations of Carrie. There was a 1999 sequel, which I have not seen. I heard it's awful. There was a 2002 made-for-TV remake starring Angela Bettis, which I tried to watch, but the look of it was really, really unappealing, and I stopped, I don't know, maybe a half an hour in. I don't even know if I made it that far. And then the 2013 remake with Chloe Grace Moretz and Julianne Moore. I've watched it once, and it's okay. Julianne Moore is really over the top, but it doesn't have that really frenetic fanaticism of Piper Laurie's performance. And although they hit the ending a little more faithfully than the original, and that ending, they did try to do the ending of the book in the movie where basically fire and brimstone are rained down on the town. And you can see little bits of it in the destruction of Carrie's house. And you'll see some rocks falling through. They kind of make it look like the house is collapsing in on itself. But they did start to film that quote-unquote brimstone falling in her house. So you'll see little black rocks falling every once in a while. And you'll see the black rocks at the end with the surprise ending that actually, the first time I watched it, scared the crap out of me.
I think it's time for a break.
Salem's Lot was King's next book, and it came out in October of 1975. King had an idea after teaching Dracula in one of his classes. What if Dracula came back in modern times? I think it was either him or his wife said, well, he'd probably get hit by a taxi in New York City. So in lieu of doing Dracula in a big city, he does him in a small town, this Jerusalem's Lot. That is one of his first fictional main towns in his writing. And I always assumed when I saw that title that it was in reference to Salem, Massachusetts, and had something to do with the witch trials. But no, it's Jerusalem's Lot. The book was turned into a mini-series by Toby Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame and came out in November of 1979. Now, I don't really recall watching it on its first airing, but I know I watched it pretty soon after because that scene, that famous scene of the boy vampire outside the window, scared the crap out of me, as it does most people who watch it for the first time. And I'm not going to get too deep into this miniseries. I may touch on it more in a later episode when I kind of pick up those outlier films or movies that were turned into something other than feature films. But I did have a funny story, or at least funny in my mind, about reading the book. And I was in high school, so maybe I didn't see the miniseries until much later. So anyway, I was reading it one night and I was home alone, so I had to have been, at least 14 or 15, and got so scared that I had to call a friend of mine. We had a pretty big house it was wide, I should say. And so one end of the house where I was sitting and reading was quite a ways away from the bedrooms and other parts of the house. And we had a big backyard. So I got a little spooked, grabbed a kitchen knife, and called my friend to kind of talk me down, I guess. There was a sequel, a 1987 film from Larry Cohen called A Return to Salem's Lot. And I had never seen it before. I watched it a couple weeks ago because I knew I was going to be talking about King adaptations. And I was kind of shocked within the first 5 minutes because I was assuming that it was a made-for-TV deal again, and it was not. And it's obviously rated R because there are boobies, right, I think, within 2 minutes of the opening of the film, and a lot of F-words. And it's not particularly gory or anything. There are some decent effects. It is not a very good movie, and I am hit and miss with Larry Cohen, or he's hit and miss with me. He is one of those on the fly, let's get this made on the cheap kind of directors whose work can be spotty, and this is not one of his better films by any stretch of the imagination, at least in my opinion. Worth a look if you're a big Stephen King and or Salem's Lot fan. And then, of course, there was a second TV miniseries with Rob Lowe, made in 2004, which is, again, okay. Even today and even in 2004, when you're doing something for TV, you're going to have to leave a lot of the stuff out that makes King books and movies so fun. So I want to say that there is going to be a new adaptation, and I forget who is involved in it. It might be James Wan producing, and I don't know who's directing. So we'll see. It should be decent.
The Shining, a masterpiece of modern horror, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, rated R, opens Friday, June 13. Check newspapers for local listings.
On October 30th, 1974, King and his wife, Tabitha, stayed at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. This would become the inspiration for his third novel, The Shining. Much like Salem's Lot was King's ode to Dracula and or vampires, The Shining is his love letter to the haunted house story, with a twist, of course. And not only do we have a haunted house and or haunted hotel, but we're back to dealing with some form of telekinesis or ESP, known in the book as The Shining. As I mentioned in the introductory episode, The Shining was my jumping off point for King. I'm rereading it currently and enjoying it. I'm not sure how many times I read and reread it back then, but I know it was at least twice. I read the book before I saw the movie. That I know. And this happens a lot with not just King adaptations, but with many books. I'll read it and kind of wonder, how are they going to approach this in the film? And I remember doing this, especially when I read Silence of the Lambs years later, and the scene where Clarice first meets Hannibal Lecter down in the, well, now I'm conflating it with the movie, but when she first meets him, when he's locked up, and the inmate or patient next to him throws his semen on her, and I thought, oh, there's no way they're going to put that in the movie, and they did. And it was a shock and disgusting and amazing all at the same time. But the book was published in 1977 and was a massive bestseller. It was only inevitable that it be turned into a film. Now, around the same time, after making Barry Lyndon, Stanley Kubrick was looking for new material to adapt. And if you know anything about Kubrick, he doesn't write original screenplays. He's usually adapting something else. In many cases, his early films were existing screenplays that he was hired to direct. And in the case of 2001, that was an original idea that he constructed with Arthur C. Clarke. But Lolita, even Dr. Strangelove was based on a book that they changed quite drastically. Barry Lyndon, A Clockwork Orange, etc. So he was searching for material. Someone gave him the manuscript of The Shining, and he was intrigued by the psychic aspects of the book. Now, The Shining may very well be the most contested and dissected of King adaptations, and that has a lot to do with the man who made the movie, Stanley Kubrick. A lot of people are not fans of the movie version, including King himself, who has been very vocal about his misgivings with how Kubrick changed the story and changed the characters. And a lot of people think it's better than the book. A lot of people like both for different reasons, and I am in that latter group. As I mentioned, I am currently rereading The Shining, and I love King's writing. There's just something, he's just so good at sucking you in. I don't know how to put that into words, but there's an ease there that seems so effortless, and it makes the reading effortless. And The Shining is a perfect example of one particular peculiarity in King's writing that I don't think I've ever experienced somewhere else, but he uses parentheses in an interesting way as a separation of, I guess, kind of a mental aside. He kind of stopped using it for a while. I don't see it in a lot of his later books, but having read the sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep, which I'll talk about in a minute, it comes back, and it's a really interesting device. The perfect example for me of how King's writing was so different from a lot of the other stuff that I was trying to read. I took a stab at Peter Straub with Ghost Story and a couple other books. Dean Koontz, I had 3 or 4 different books, but nothing just hit that sweet spot like King. So there's always that division between book and movie, and there's very rare instances where the movie is quote unquote better than the book. I mean, you're dealing with fans of the written material a lot of the time, and it's hard to hit all those beats in a movie. Movies have to be shorter, a lot of stuff has to be excised, and generally, since they're 2 different mediums, things have to be changed. You can do a lot visually more quickly than you can in a book. And I think it is the perfect example of that, which we'll get to later. But there is so much backstory on even the most minor of characters in that, there would be no way to film it. So Kubrick took The Shining and made it his own movie. And you can have a problem with that, or you can appreciate both on their own merits, which is how I approach it. I really enjoy the book. I love the movie. This is one of those touchstone films for me from back in the early to mid 80s. It was a big deal, of course, when it came out. I was too young to see it, but as soon as I was able, I rented it. It's possible that I saw it on TV first, but then you start to see the differences, and there were numerous differences. I missed the topiary animals from the novel. I was a little disappointed in the ending, I recall. And of course, there was a different ending that was changed after the movie. The prints were sent out to theaters and were famously cut. Somebody had to go drive around, had specific instructions from Kubrick to excise the ending at this point and then reinsert the credits. So it more closely matched the ending of the book, but there's still some major differences. I have a couple different memories of watching this, and I don't know if one of these was the first time or not, but I do remember watching it with a couple of friends at my house and being completely freaked out by the Grady twins, or Grady sisters. I'm not sure. It's kind of vague as to whether they're twins or not. I don't think the girls that played them were actually twins, but man, when they first showed them, it was unnerving, and I hate to say it, but part of it had to do with their facial features, and some of that I know is the lighting now, but their faces didn't look right, and that was upsetting. And every time they showed up, it was like, get them off the screen. I cannot deal with this. And then my other fond memory is catching this at my friend Andy's house. It was either a birthday party for him or possibly a Halloween party. I just remember a ton of kids from school being there. We watched this and a couple other movies. This may have actually been when we watched Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter as well. It happened at his house. That happened at his house too. I don't know if it was the same night. If it was, that was an epic night of horror movie watching. But otherwise, the movie isn't really all that scary, and that is one of the criticisms, that because of Kubrick and his what people think of as his detached and cold nature, he just couldn't buy into the supernatural aspect of the film. And I don't know if I agree with that or not. This is the kind of problem that I've had over the years with the movie. It was a favorite for a long time, and I remember a few years back talking to my friend Ronnie about King adaptations, and I would go through these periods of looking for every King movie that I could find and watching them. And I think I told him I'm done with The Shining. I don't ever need to watch that movie again because it's kind of boring. It's long. It's over 2 hours. Not a whole lot happens, and it's not all that scary. But I keep going back to it. I watch it at least 3 or 4 times a year. And that may just be on in the background, but if I stumble across it, if it's on, I will finish it. And most of that has to do with Kubrick's style, the amazing production design of the movie, the music, that one-point perspective of Kubrick's. This is one of the films where I really first noticed that. And just in the initial meeting of Jack Nicholson's character with the hotel manager, Stuart Ullman, that room in its subtle mauve coloring and that one-point perspective shot and the lighting and everything, it's just so definitively Kubrick. Of course, all the tracking shots with the Steadicam, it just really sucks me in on a visual level alone, even if the movie isn't all that scary or if it's not all that faithful to the book. I can watch it for those reasons alone. But as I mentioned, King is critical of this adaptation because he felt that Kubrick simply didn't get it and changed the characters a little too much. As I'm reading the book, I'm not really seeing that as much as King makes it out to be. We have the criticism that with the casting of Jack Nicholson, Jack Torrance seems crazy from the get-go. Well, he's not so much crazy from the get-go in the book, but he has serious issues from the get-go in the book. More to do with anger and alcoholism than insanity, but he's troubled from the beginning. So I kind of dismiss that criticism. And then we have the portrayal of Wendy with Shelley Duvall, and that was another major criticism of King. And it ended up being a criticism of a lot of critics, too, that her portrayal was so hysterical, and that in the novel, Wendy is much more capable and strong. And again, I can see where Kubrick picked that up. There's a couple interesting quotes from Kubrick about the movie that sort of settle this kind of debate for me. On the book itself, he said in an interview from way back, the manuscript of the novel was sent to me by John Calley of Warner Brothers. I thought it was one of the most ingenious and exciting stories of the genre I had read. It seemed to strike an extraordinary balance between the psychological and the supernatural, in such a way as to lead you to think that the supernatural would eventually be explained by the psychological. Jack must be imagining things because he's crazy. This allowed you to suspend your doubt of the supernatural until you were so thoroughly into the story that you could accept it almost without noticing. And that is a good point. That's sort of the main thrust of the book and the movie. Is anything supernatural happening, or is it that these people are going crazy with cabin fever? It's what I found so particularly clever about the way the novel was written. As the supernatural events occurred, you searched for an explanation, and the most likely one seemed to be that the strange things that were happening would finally be explained as the products of Jack's imagination. It's not until Grady, the ghost of the former caretaker who axed to death his family, slides open the bolt of the larder door, allowing Jack to escape, that you are left with no other explanation but the supernatural. And that's true upon my first viewings of the movie. When Jack sees the bartender in the Gold Lounge, when he runs into Delbert Grady, you kind of assume that he's gone nuts. And of course, Jack Nicholson plays nuts very well. You have the other side of it with Danny and his ability to see things, which is obviously more hashed out in the book. But I think that question is left a bit longer in the movie, and that makes it successful to me. And then on the portrayal of Wendy by Shelley Duvall, I kind of like this quote from the same interview. I had seen all of her films and greatly admired her work. I think she brought an instantly believable characterization to her part. The novel pictures her as a much more self-reliant and attractive woman, but these qualities make you wonder why she has put up with Jack for so long. Shelley seemed to be exactly the kind of woman that would marry Jack and be stuck with him. And I used to think, that she came off as shrill and hysterical. And again, I kind of lean towards the depiction in the movie more than in the book. It does make more sense for her to be that way and stay with him. And she does overcome that in the movie. She is the savior of the film. But Kubrick was also really hard on her during the making of the movie. And I don't know if this was a part of that he was that way to get that performance out of her, but that kind of stuff bugs me. And, this is especially true of directors, back in the 40s and 50s that were famously cruel to their actors to elicit a performance. And I think that's kind of bullshit. It's like, just talk it out and rehearse. And they obviously rehearsed, but figure out a better way to elicit a performance other than berating and belittling your actors. And if you watch the making of The Shining, which Kubrick's daughter shot, you see examples of Kubrick being a real big dick to Shelley Duvall. she's kind of gone back and forth on how she feels about it, but yeah, it's a pretty shitty way to motivate an actor. And like the topiary animals, there are a couple of other major aspects of the book that are missing from the film, including the boiler, which is what Jack is tasked to take care of during the long winter. And it is instrumental in the finale of the book. And then we have the scrapbook with newspaper articles and other things from the dark history of the Overlook Hotel that he becomes obsessed with, and that is going to be turned into a book. And the scrapbook is only shown, I think, in one shot on the writing table in the movie, and is mentioned briefly when Jack runs into the previous caretaker who murdered his family. He mentions that he read about him in an article. I can understand why they were excised, and I can also understand why people think that they should have been left in since they're so instrumental in the story. But sometimes you have to make difficult decisions when you're cutting the fat to trim down the source material. And it does kind of make sense. It really streamlines the movie itself to where it is just these three characters and their interactions and how they're all dealing with this isolation. Now, that was remedied in the 1997 miniseries, which King wrote and was directed by Mick Garris. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of most of Mick Garris's King adaptations. And I like Mick Garris. He's a big promoter of horror and the people that make horror movies. I think it's that fat and cheesiness that can run through King's work that Garris leaves in that I think the adaptations suffer from. To be as succinct about it as possible, there is a lot of cheesy stuff in King's books, and especially the longer books. Along with exclusions that Kubrick made, there are some insertions of material that is particular to the movie itself. The Grady twins, or girls, that Danny sees are only in the movie. They are mentioned in the book, but they're not shown as one of Danny's visions. And the famous all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy that he has obsessively typed on hundreds and hundreds of sheets of paper in different variations, and it changes the dynamic of what he's working on while he's there, but it simplifies the point that he is being adversely affected by the hotel. And since it's inundated our popular culture, it's easy to forget that it's not in the book. And then we have the interesting bit at the end where Shelley Duvall is roaming through the hotel and comes across all these images of ghosts. But I think this is kind of clever. I think maybe Kubrick is assuming you've read the book, and so you'll understand who and what these things are. And of course, the most famous one is the guy in the dog costume and the man laying on the bed. And it's very vague in the movie as to what's happening, but it is fleshed out in the novel. And I won't give it away, but if you haven't read the book, find that part in the book and read it. A lot of people take this view that The Shining isn't a horror movie, that it's like a black comedy, or it is a treatise, like it's an essay on horror movies. And I don't think that that's the case. I think he was trying to make a scary movie. It's just that he really didn't know how to do it. Maybe that emotional aspect that we derive from horror films may have been absent from his mind during the making of it. But hey, you can view the movie however you want. You can side with Stephen King and think that it missed the mark. Doesn't really matter. It's a whole other thing on its own. That does bring up, though, the documentary Room 237, which I mentioned when I was talking to Sam Panico, that I have not watched all the way through. And it's just because mainly I don't buy into all the conspiracy theories and fan theories about the movie. Kubrick is oftentimes seen as this kind of eccentric, recluse genius. Not that he wasn't any of those things, I don't know. That he was so detailed and specific about things that everything in the movies has meaning. I'm sure that a lot of the stuff has meaning and had meaning to him. But remember, he doesn't make everything that ends up in the film. We've got production designers, we have set designers, all these hundreds of people working on a movie, and it's very possible that these images of Indian heads and all this other stuff is just because they put it in there. Now, a lot of the rooms were based on rooms from the Ahwahnee Hotel, which is in Yosemite, that's close by here to Fresno, and that has Native American decor. So it could all be just coincidence. It brings to mind for me the fact that, and this is something that blew me away when I first found out about it, all the interiors are sets. This was not filmed at a real hotel. The exterior is a hotel in Oregon on Mount Hood. It's not the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. All those massive rooms, the Gold Lounge and that room where Jack writes, are all constructed on a set. And that just always blew my mind. The whole thing with the maze and when Jack looks down on it, that was partially a set, the inside where you can see Wendy and Danny walking around, and then the rest is like a matte painting, and it's seamless. So that kind of stuff boggles my mind more than whether, the Calumet Indian head is pointing in a certain direction in certain scenes and all these other goofy theories. One last thing before I finish with The Shining. I know this has gone on for a while, but I almost forgot about this. At the end of the film, when Danny is being chased through the maze by Jack, he stops at one point and starts walking backwards. And when I first saw the movie, this scene freaked me out a little bit because I thought he was being pulled back by a supernatural entity or something. And it took me a while to realize that he was backtracking on his own footprints so that they would end and that Jack would not know where to go once he reached the end of those tracks, which leads right into the final shots of the film. Now, Dr. Sleep is the sequel to The Shining, and it came out, a number of years ago, and I didn't read it. I hadn't gotten back into reading Stephen King yet. Just within the last month or two, I decided, well, the movie is coming out, I better read Dr. Sleep. And I had heard about the plot and this idea of the True Knot, this group of kind of psychic vampires that are hunting Danny Torrance. And I thought it sounded kind of silly, like some of King's later work that I didn't enjoy as much as these early novels. But I read it and really liked it, and I'm really excited about the sequel, the movie sequel. Now, since they're different things and they end differently, Dick Halloran, the character played by Scatman Crothers in the movie, gets killed. So we have this whole long exploration of his getting back to the hotel, and it ends abruptly. And that's, again, another thing that people have trouble with, but I think it's kind of brilliant in a way. And so this makes Wendy the savior, like I mentioned earlier. But in the book, he survives. Wendy and Danny survive, and Jack is blown up in the hotel. He kind of sacrifices himself so that Danny and Wendy will get out of there. Dr. Sleep dismisses everything that happens in Kubrick's movie. Now, the movie version of Dr. Sleep is actually combining the two. I became aware of this when they started showing the trailer for it. It's directed by Mike Flanagan, which I'm really excited about because I liked most of his movies, and he has done one of the better Stephen King adaptations with Gerald's Game. That's a plus. It's got a bunch of actors that I really like, including Alex Esso and Jocelyn Donahue, who I talked about on one of the Women in Horror Month episodes back in February. The trailer has these recreated clips from Kubrick's The Shining. And so it'll be interesting to see how they navigate that combination of the two source materials for the sequel. And it has, from my understanding, it has the approval of Stephen King and the approval of the Kubrick estate. So again, it'll be interesting to see how that all works out. And that's coming out, I think, in November of this year. May actually get my butt to the theater to see it. Okay, I think it's best that we move on. See, I went off script. I've got my PowerPoint presentation on The Shining, and it was much briefer. So maybe there'll be some editing done here.
As soon as possible. As soon as possible.
The next novel that King published was The Stand. And so that was 1978. It's a really long book, really interesting concept. We kind of get away from the straight up horror here. And we have the idea of a plague that has decimated most of the United States. And I think it's creeping into other parts of the world. It's been a long time since I read the book, and I have not reread this one. I remember, though, when I was reading it, this was kind of when AIDS was becoming a national health concern. And I saw the parallels there. And of course, the novel was written before that. And the illness in The Stand isn't really AIDS-like, but just that idea of a virus that is incurable. Because of the length of the novel, it was hard to get this to the screen, and originally there was a planned film version that was going to be directed by George Romero, who had done Creepshow with King, and that's one that I'll talk about at a later time. And that eventually died out, and then it was turned into a mini-series in 1994 by our friend Mick Garris. And this is very similar to what happened to me with the It mini-series. I started out watching it and then lost interest really quickly. And to me, this is very much a 90s TV mini-series. The book is epic in scale. It crosses the country. They do that in the miniseries, so credit for that. Just a lot of and there's a lot of acid wash, a lot of mullets, and, some of that kind of cheesy King dialogue is a little heavy in it. There are a lot of King regulars in the cast, though. We have Gary Sinise, who would be in The Green Mile. We have Rob Lowe, who, again, was in the second iteration of Salem's Lot. We've got Ed Harris, who was in Creepshow and Needful Things. Kathy Bates, who was in Misery, and probably a few others. It just doesn't do much for me. I've watched it a couple times. Again, like I say, when I go through those big King swings, if it's available, I'll kind of muscle through it. But it is not one of my favorite adaptations. It is being turned into another miniseries, which will probably be on CBS All Access, from what I understand. And that's where Mr. Mercedes is currently available, which I have not read and I have not seen since we don't have CBS All Access. That's one of those streaming services that I kind of give the side eye to. I'm not really sure that it's got enough good stuff to warrant doing, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I think it's time for a break.
The Dead Zone, published in 1979, was King's fifth novel under his own name. The two Richard Bachman books, Rage and The Long Walk, had been published in 1977 and 1979, respectively. The short story collection Night Shift had come out in 1978, the same year as The Stand. That's a lot of books in a 6-year period. Not that they were all written in those years. A lot of that stuff was written years before, but still, it gives you an idea of how prolific King was, especially in the early days. I remember finding The Dead Zone quite fascinating to read. I really enjoyed the move away from spooky horror to this more psychological drama. And there was something about the melancholy character of John Smith that appealed to me. The paperback version that I have is the movie tie-in version, so there is a picture of Christopher Walken on the front and pictures inside the book from the movie. And I would have seen those images in the book and read the book before I saw the movie. Since the film came out in 83, it wouldn't have been out on video until 84, and so I wouldn't have seen it until I was 15 or so.
Stephen King, author of Cujo and Carrie. David Cronenberg, director of Scanners. Together, they put you in the grip of the dead zone.
You're a devil. Son of a man.
From the mind of Stephen King, a vision of the future. The Dead Zone. Rated R.
The movie was directed by David Cronenberg, who I was familiar with because of the movie Scanners. I don't think at this age I had taken a dive into his earlier works like Shivers and Rabid and The Brood. This same year, Videodrome came out. Remember being quite intrigued by that movie. His combination of almost perverse sexuality and social constraints, and it just a little bit too much for me at that age. Scanners kind of didn't involve a lot of the sexuality that Rabid and Shivers included, and so that was all about, exploding heads and great special effects, so that's why I clung to that one. But at some point, probably after The Fly came out, I did go back and deep dive into Cronenberg's stuff. But for me, at the time, it didn't mean all that much other than he had made Scanners, and it was a Stephen King adaptation. And it happens to be one of my all-time favorite King adaptations to film. It's not as faithful to the book as, say, Carrie, and it's more faithful than The Shining. The novel itself was sort of split between the characters of John Smith, who Christopher Walken plays in the movie, and the character of Greg Stilson, who Martin Sheen plays, and it's back and forth between the two from childhood until their lives intersect. And in the movie, it's really focused on Christopher Walken's character and his accident and being in a coma and then coming out and realizing that he has some form of telekinetic power, or not telekinetic, telepathic power. One of the notable things about the book, at least for me, is that it is the first appearance of the fictional town of Castle Rock. And I always remember being super happy when that town would show up in his work. We had Jerusalem's Lot earlier that was a fictional town, and then Castle Rock, and that would weave in and out of many of his novels and short stories for years to come. And of course, we have the TV show Castle Rock that's on Hulu that's actually pretty darn good. And this is quite different than a lot of other Cronenberg movies. It's almost the bridge between the earlier movies that I mentioned and later work that was more psychological, like Crash, and even later than that with the movies with Viggo Mortensen. But the novel itself isn't strictly horror. We have the aspect of a psychic ability like we did in Carrie and even in The Shining, but we're not talking about haunted houses or vampires or werewolves. This is really more of a personal drama with a character that happens to have quote-unquote second sight. And since we don't get the whole childhood part of the story, it really just becomes apparent when Smith comes out of his coma and touches a nurse that has come to his bedside. And this is one of my favorite scenes in the movies. One of the things that really drew it to me early on, because I saw the pictures of this in the novel tie-in that I have. And it's with Christopher Walken laying on a bed, and he sees a girl in a room that's on fire. And so we have these flashes of him in the hospital and then him in this room where he is seeing the vision, and he's laying in the girl's bed and it's covered with flames, and it's got a kind of a surreal touch to it. And it makes that transition of his sight a lot more interesting than doing, fuzzy images or, it's not a trick of the camera. It's just putting him in that situation. And they do it a couple other times as well. And it's one of the things that I really like about the movie. I think that this, along with The Deer Hunter, were really my introductions to Christopher Walken and his interesting delivery, his interesting look. And I just remember being really intrigued by his hair in this movie.
It's time for another tangent.
And I'm sorry, but I have to do a little tangent here about hair in movies. And this happened to me with Blade Runner, with Harrison Ford's hair in that. And, it was kind of a new wave. Not very many people in the early 80s had closely cropped hair like that. It was all bowl cuts and mullets and everything else. And then the same thing with Mad Max, with Mel Gibson in that. His hair was super intriguing to me. I wanted my hair cut like that with a little swath of blonde in it. But so Christopher Walken's hair intrigued me as well. I don't know what it is about early 80s hairdos in movies, but it was a definite thing for me. But I love Christopher Walken in this movie, and the acting all around is great. The direction, the cold, they shot this in Vancouver, I think, so the snow was real. You get that real melancholy feel of a snowbound place. Plus, the character of John Smith is melancholy. He has this ability, but it's also killing him. And this is one of the differences from book to film that I never really caught on because I read the book first, and so I filled in the blanks in the film. But the dead zone is actually represented differently in each. In the book, it's actually a part of John's brain that is damaged, and so that's the dead zone, and it's part of what gives him this ability or half ability to see things that may or may not change. In the movie, the dead zone is described by his doctor as those blank spots in the visions that represent, that change can happen, that he can affect the future that he sees. And that, of course, is what happens at the beginning when he sees the nurse's daughter in the room. She's saved. And then the major part of the movie when he sees the things that Greg Stilson is going to do, he can affect change in them. They're not set in stone. But in the book, it's explicit that he has a brain tumor, and this is what's causing his ability. Now, in the movie, they never say brain tumor, but I just always assumed that they were getting at the same thing because John has headaches. He knows that he's not going to live for much longer, and the assumption is there's a tumor in his brain. So I guess I just filled in those blanks for myself. I filled in the dead zone for myself. So along with Christopher Walken, we have Brooke Adams as his girlfriend Sarah, who gets married while he is in his coma. We've got, but they reconnect, of course. We have Tom Skerritt as Sheriff Bannerman, who is a character that is in a number of King books, including Cujo, and Herbert Lom as Dr. Sam Weizak. But he will always be Inspector Dreyfus from the Pink Panther movies to me, as well as being in a number of Hammer horror movies. This is quite possibly Martin Sheen's creepiest role since The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. A different kind of creepy, but it is chilling, the visions that John sees concerning this charismatic shyster politician running for Senate. Watching it now, you'll kind of see some eerie similarities to what's happening in the world today, and it's even more frightening now than it was back then. And along with Carrie and The Shining, we've got another great score here by, this time by Michael Kamen, who was not Cronenberg's usual scorer.
That doesn't sound right.
Composer? He usually worked with Howard Shore, and I actually think they may have worked together from the beginning, but it is a great score, and just for whatever it's worth, I've been playing the scores of each of the films in those sections that I talk about. And I didn't even discuss the score of The Shining. I went on so damn long, but it's got a great Wendy Carlos opening and a lot of classic music in it that is just perfect for that film.
The ice is gonna break!
And The Dead Zone kind of represents this shift in adaptations that is part of the reason why I structured these episodes this way. The book came out in 1979. The movie didn't come out until 1983. And the Cujo adaptation actually predated it. But Cujo the book was printed 2 years later, and Firestarter was in between, and that one comes out later. So at that point, we've got this greater deviance in time between the novels and the adaptation. So that's kind of the big reason why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. And like I mentioned, Night Shift came out before The Dead Zone, and there have been a number of film adaptations based on stories from that collection. We have Children of the Corn from 1984, Cat's Eye from 1985, which included 2 stories from that collection, Quitters, Inc. and The Ledge, and then another story that was written for the movie itself, Maximum Overdrive, which was based on the short story Trucks. We'll talk about all these a little more in depth later on. Graveyard Shift, which came out in 1990, which is a very 1990s adaptation, as is The Lawnmower Man, which I'm pretty sure I saw in the theater and was seriously disappointed with because it has absolutely nothing to do with the short story. It is a very weird short story, and the movie is completely weird in a totally different way. And then The Mangler came out in 1995, directed by Tobe Hooper, and it is really low on the adaptation totem pole in my mind. And then there were some television adaptations too, and I didn't realize this one was a TV movie. Sometimes They Come Back, which was directed by Tom McLaughlin and has, I'm kind of surprised it was a TV movie. I wonder if it was for a cable channel because I think the special effects are pretty gory. And then Trucks, which was another version of Maximum Overdrive based on the story Trucks. It's pretty awful. Battleground was part of the miniseries Nightmare and Dreamscapes, and I don't think I've seen any of those. And then there was another iteration of Children of the Corn back in 2009 on the Sci-Fi Channel, which I have not seen yet. I've seen a couple of the sequels. We'll get into all that later. But for now, that is the end of this first episode. It went a little longer than I expected, but hopefully you stuck around till the end. Next up will be the years 1980 to 83, and that includes the films Firestarter, Cujo, Pet Sematary, and Christine. Ooh, 4 movies. I better keep it brief. All right, thank you so much for listening. Subscribe, rate, and review wherever you happen to listen to this. And don't forget to wake up heavy.
Here's Johnny.